As a young woman, she'd always sought father figures, from the flirtatious Lord Melbourne to her angel, Albert. Now she had another man by her side.
I feel I have here, and always in the house, a good, devoted soul, whose only object and interest is my service. And God knows how much I want so to be taken care of.
These are the words the 45-year-old Victoria wrote about Albert's Highland servant, a Mr. John Brown, who was brought down from Balmoral to attend Victoria at Osborne in 1864. I honestly think that if it hadn't been for the Highlands of Scotland and the friendship of John Brown in those 10 years after Prince Albert died, that Queen Victoria would have gone stark, staring mad. She'd always loved it here in Scotland, since her early visits with Albert. And the unaffected character of the Highlanders made such a refreshing change after the stuffiness of Windsor and Buckingham Palace. And so it was that the bearded and kilted John Brown, 7 years her junior, became Victoria's next male dependency as closest companion and best friend. Raymond Lamont Brown is the Highland servant's official biographer. She spent far more time with John Brown than with any other person.
Yes.
Certainly more than any member of her family.
Yes, that's true. He would attend her whenever she needed him. He understood her very well. I think something that her family and her ministers didn't understand, that although she was surrounded by people all the time, she was very lonely. And John Brown said to her quite openly, "I think you're just a lonely wee bairn that needs to be brought out of herself." And that's exactly what he did. He sort of pulled her out of her depression. He became a walking encyclopedia of Queen Victoria's likes and dislikes, her neuroses and so on. He devoted his life to her. He never went on holiday, and he was always there for her.
In some ways, it was an even greater commitment than Albert made himself in his marriage vows, because it was one of absolute service.
Yes, yes. Albert, of course, had his own agenda of the things that he did. But for John Brown, from dawn to dusk, his agenda was Queen Victoria.
Alongside Brown's devotion to the Queen came an abruptness and complete disregard for court etiquette, something which Brown could see that Victoria, contrary to her steely appearance, rather enjoyed. Whilst these qualities of Brown's enraged the household, they were precisely the things that made him the ideal companion for Victoria. Great man that Albert had been, he'd always been sickly and fussy. He didn't share his wife's love of guzzling and drinking, whereas Brown loved his whiskey. He was often tipsy. He liked pouring whiskey into the Queen's milk and saying, "Don't stay thirsty." Victoria wouldn't credit what I'm about to say, but Brown released her from Albert. He released her inner capacity for hedonism and fun, and she revelled in it. Cheerio! Victoria found freedom in her friendship with this most unlikely of characters, out riding and laughing in the grounds at Osborne with Brown. Where she had been suppressed in her childhood by the cruel workings of Sir John Conroy, and had struggled with an overbearing and scheming husband, she loved Brown's openness and dedication to her and her alone.
It is a real comfort, for Brown is devoted to me. So simple, so intelligent, and so unlike an ordinary servant.
No one could talk to Victoria as John Brown did. He held her in check. There was once an occasion when a footman came into the room carrying a tray, and the poor boy dropped it. The Queen erupted with rage. said he should be dismissed to the kitchens, but John Brown intervened immediately. "Woman, what are ye doing to that poor laddie? Are ye nae dropping anything yourself?" The footman was reinstated. The straight-talking Scotsman had put the Queen of England in her place, and she enjoyed it. But it wasn't just Brown's frankness she relished. He also filled a deep emotional need in Victoria. On the 4th anniversary of Albert's death, she completely defied convention by bringing Brown to pay his respects at Albert's mausoleum. Her writings that day show just how significant Brown's response was for Victoria.
When he came to my room later, he was so much affected. He said in his simple, expressive way, with such a tender look of pity while the tears rolled down his cheeks, "I didn't like to see you at Frogmore this morning. I felt for you, but what could I do for you? I could die for you."
I don't think anybody could ever have replaced Prince Albert, but she needed some kind of male clutch, and John Brown supplied that.
What came next showed the contradictory nature of Victoria's character. The woman who shied away from the public decided to share her thoughts with everyone. We tend to think that Diana, Princess of Wales, invented the concept of "feel my pain," but Queen Victoria got there before her with her decision to publish extracts of her private diaries. Leaves from the Journal of Our Life in the Highlands. It came out in 1868 and was an instant bestseller. No monarch had ever published a book before. This one was wholly at odds with Victoria, the Weeping Widow. The journals chronicle her life of outdoor frivolity. She felt truly elated out in the open Highland landscape, at local dances, and at the annual Highland Games. The games began about 3 o'clock, she writes. 1, throwing the hammer. 2, tossing the caber. 3, putting the stone. A pretty wild sight. But the men looked very cold with nothing but their shirts and kilts on. They ran beautifully. The journals are pretty mild stuff. The remarkable thing about them is that they were published at all. They're nice books, they're bound in green, embossed in gold, and pretty soon they'd sold over 100,000 copies. There is one person, however, that might be named as the hero of the book, and that, of course, is John Brown. Her children hardly got a look in and weren't best pleased. But it seemed that Victoria was unaware. Instead, she wrote to her eldest, Vicky, asking for validation of the book.
"You have never said one word about my poor little Highland book, my only book. I had hoped that you and Fritz would have liked it."
The reason Vicky might have been avoiding the subject was that her mother's shameless adoration of Brown was causing a scandal. A scurrilous pamphlet entitled "John Brown's Legs" appeared in New York. It was dedicated to those extraordinary legs, poor bruised and scratched darlings. Here's the Queen looking at a damaged knee. Good heavens, what a knee! Sticking out from the kilt of John Brown. What's so hilarious about this is that while the American was penning this pamphlet, the Queen herself was writing a 3rd volume of Leaves from Our Life in the Highlands, in effect a biography of John Brown. The court and the politicians were absolutely horrified, and somebody had to be delegated to tell her that the book was entirely inappropriate. They chose the poor young Dean of Windsor, and he went in and told the Queen that it really wasn't a very good idea to be writing these memoirs of her life with Brown. It would be misconstrued. She erupted with rage. However, she took the young man's advice, and the matter was never mentioned again. I wonder if it still survives somewhere in Windsor, in those archives, or whether Princess Beatrice, the wrecker, destroyed it. Thanks to Victoria's youngest daughter, Beatrice, no trace remains of the Queen's life with John Brown in her voluminous journals. We're left with silence, as her children were intent on deleting Brown and anything else deemed unsuitable from history. It's poignantly sad that so avid a scribbler and recorder of her times as Queen Victoria should have had her words suppressed. And of course, the suppression has the precisely opposite effect upon us that it was intended to do. Instead of making us forget about John Brown and Victoria, it makes us obsessed by the subject. What we do know is that in favouring Brown, Victoria showed herself to be a woman desperate for companionship, irrespective of the social cost. She'd come such a long way from her days as the submissive wife of Albert. With Brown, she was free to do as she pleased. Of course, people suspected him of sleeping with Victoria. There's a bit of a feminist issue here. If she'd been a male monarch going to bed with a parlourmaid, no one would have batted an eyelid. It's the idea of a woman crossing the class barrier that really appalled them. Especially as the rumours mounted to that of a secret marriage, even a love child, between the Queen and her Highland servant. A man who was probably one of the very few people in the world who ever knew the full truth about her relationship with Brown was her last doctor, Sir James Reed. Oh, goodness.
The whole collection.
Michaela, Lady Reed, is married to his grandson. He kept a diary while he worked with her.
Yes, and there are 40 little tiny diaries here. See, his writing was minuscule.
Oh, isn't it wonderful?
If you read a lot, you really require a magnifying glass. Yes.
And here are some more diaries.
Yes, this is one from March.
This is the Queen and Brown, I think.
Yes, she has a fall. They were going up and down the stairs, Brown and the Queen.
It was Brown, of course, carried her. Reed wasn't allowed so much as to touch her.
Well, he was allowed to offer his arm.
But, I mean, he wasn't allowed to examine her.
No, certainly wouldn't be allowed to carry her up and down the stairs.
Whereas Brown was allowed to enfold her in his arms.
Yes. And they were laughing about it all and thought it was great fun.
And then
the next day, it says the Queen walked a little in the room. Brown lifts his kilt and says, "Is it there?" And she lifts her skirt laughing and says, "No, it's here."
She was moving his big manly hand on the side of her bottom.
Yes, but I think she's pointing,
she's
lifting her long skirt.
But also the idea of a woman lifting her skirt in those days.
Yes. It was very forward.
It was raffish.
They were obviously very intimate.
Is there a feeling in the Reed family that Dr. Reed knew the nature of the relationship?
Yes, there is a feeling. And we used to tease Granny, as we called her, his widow, about John Brown and the relationship. And she would always clam up.
She clammed up.
Yeah, she just laughed and dismissed it.
What do you think?
I don't think they were married. I don't think they even had an immoral affair. I think that they expressed their feelings so much in public. Had they been having an affair, they would have been more circumspect about it.
There's also the kind of physical detail that we now know because of Dr. Reed examining her body after she died, isn't there?
Yes, she had a prolapsed uterus, which would have made any form of intercourse extremely painful, probably impossible. So I don't think it was that sort of relationship, and I certainly don't think that she would have had a child, because she was...
Oh, no, that's preposterous.
Preposterous, which has been said.
Oh, yes, it has. When anybody knows that I'm writing about Queen Victoria, they've always been asking me the same question. What was the relationship between John Brown and the Queen? Were they lovers? And I'm afraid to say that on that question, I'm a complete agnostic. It's plainly not a relationship like that between her and Albert. She was so open about loving Brown, about wanting Brown to hold her and carry about in public and laugh with her, that I'm sure there was no kind of secret, covert relationship going on. I think the likeliest thing, if you actually wanted to force me to make up my mind, is that they had a tactile, loving relationship which involved lots of hugging, but that they weren't lovers in the true sense of the word.